Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's online launch for Forced Migration Review number 71 on socio-economic integration. We're delighted to have so many of you here, and we'll just wait a couple of seconds just to make sure that all of our speakers and panelists are with us and have been upgraded sufficiently on Zoom so that they can speak to you all. I can already see some of our speakers for today. Wonderful to have you here, Asako, Akai, and all of the authors, and welcome, Alex. Great to have you too. So without further ado, we'll just touch on a couple of housekeeping things. This session will be recorded, and so if for any reason you don't want to have your presence seen, then please do keep your video off. We have people from all over the world joining us, and we're just really delighted to have this opportunity to share this great issue with you. I'm Alice Phillip. I'm the Forced Migration Review Managing Editor. I'm going to host this event, but mostly you'll be hearing from people who are much more clued up on this topic and who have a lot of great things to say. So it's going to be about an hour. We will definitely let you go by the hour's time. And I want to thank everybody who's been involved in the project, which has begun about a year ago, and which it's wonderful to see come to fruition, particularly our main partner on this issue, UNDP, who have been so faithful, both in working with us on the content and reviewing, but also making a really generous financial contribution to the issue. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Asako Akai, who is the UN Assistant Secretary General and Director of the UNDP Crisis Bureau, and she's going to begin with some opening remarks. So Asako, over to you.
Thank you, Alice. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be with you to present the latest edition of the Forced Migration Review. I would like to thank its editors and authors, especially those joining us on the panel whose perspective will be illuminating today's conversation. And publications like the Forced Migration Review and dialogues such as ours today are more important than ever. Today, forced displacement is on the rise in every region of the world, with 100 million refugees and internally displaced people recorded last year. And as conflict spreads and disasters intensify, the numbers continue to rise. These numbers are expected to surge in coming decades due to climate change and natural disasters. We just see in Turkey and Syria a terrible earthquake, but the projection is so huge because of the climate emergency. And so it is essential that we do all we can to ensure these events are met with informed policy and better understanding of both the cost of inaction and the shared benefits of investing in that integration. So we know that forcibly displaced people have been unfairly and inaccurately portrayed. These perceptions hinder integration, forestall progress, and trap entire communities in protracted displacement. It is long past time to lift the stigma, to shift the perception from burden to benefit, to help people build their own capabilities and contribute to the economies and societies in which they live. So the Forced Migration Review is doing just that. As this edition so clearly illustrates, when socio-economic integration plans are in place, refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people can become invaluable contributors to the development of their host communities. UNDP is proud to contribute to these efforts. In Moldova, for example, UNDP has helped national and local administrations deliver job search services through a digital platform, intensive skills training, and language classes for Ukrainian refugees. We also engaged the private sector in IT, sports, food, and interior design to create opportunities and provide training within their companies. For instance, Ukrainian refugees will be employed as a first-time coding teachers on the Bloom coding platform after receiving on-the-job tech training. Or in Somalia, building the capacity of district councillors means they can advocate for a better treatment and fair use of resources for IDPs. In our recent report on internal displacement titled Turning the Tide, we showed how fostering integration in displacement affected communities can improve the prospect of IDPs, especially those of women and girls. When displaced people benefit from training and education opportunities, when they can work and create their own businesses, they maintain personal dignity and preserve local stability, and they become agents of development. However, many legislative, administrative, and financial barriers prevent this progress. UNDP works with government, the private sector, and civil society to remove these barriers. In Colombia, for instance, UNDP and its partners strengthen national and local administrations so they can put in place the right policies to promote integration. And we help representatives from displaced and host communities advocate for their rights with government officials and the private sector. Still, we must do more. As this edition of the Forced Migration Review shows, despite the many crises of the moment and challenges ahead, we have a distinct opportunity before us. With better understanding, increased effort, and broader coordination, we can speed up integration, expand opportunities, and transform the lives of displaced people and their host communities at once. Socio-economic integration can be a springboard to a more sustainable approach to forced displacement. The task now falls to all of us to deliver on the changes that are so urgently needed. We look forward to hearing from the authors with us today. With your perspective and our joint efforts, we can transform displacement from crisis to opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asako, for that fantastic introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Bertham. I'm the Deputy Editor at FMR, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of the articles in FMR 71 and tell you how you can access the issue. So before I do, I wanted to also acknowledge the many high-quality articles that sadly we were unable to include in the issue. Our selection was really challenging for this issue, and we tried to represent different viewpoints, different geographical locations, and different a discussion of different aspects of the theme in the final issue. Unfortunately, due to funding constraints, we were unable to produce our usual translations for this issue, but we really maintain our commitment at FMR to providing the magazine in other languages. And we hope that for this issue, people are able to use online translation tools to access the content that they're interested in. So this issue asks us to reimagine socioeconomic integration, to think about why a focus on integration is important now, about what needs to change and who needs to be involved in this new conversation. Our opening articles introduce us to the concept of socioeconomic integration. They emphasize why it matters as an integral part of both refugee protection and durable solutions, and clear up the confusion between the concepts of local integration and local settlement, and the more recently introduced notion of local solutions. A number of articles focus on much needed policy shifts, including exploring the role of social connections on refugee integration and the role of schools and other public services. Reflecting on the Jordan Compact, one article analyzes the effect of labour market policies on Syrians' economic integration. Other thought-provoking articles draw lessons from Jordan, Kenya, and Afghanistan. One of these case studies highlights the need for access to basic economic rights as a prerequisite for financial inclusion. Others discuss the involvement of the private sector, reflecting on how to attract private firms to invest in refugee hosting areas, and exploring the role of public-private partnerships. A few articles discuss the importance of legal avenues for integration. One article calls for refugees to have legal access to the global digital economy and explores the potential of the digital economy to facilitate integration. Others address legal challenges and barriers to integration in Turkey and in India. The need to include the voices of displaced persons is emphasized by various authors. Perspectives are shared from affected populations in Uganda and from IDPs in Burkina Faso. A couple of articles put the spotlight on women's initiatives, whether those relate to the cultural knowledge and practices of internally displaced women in Colombia, or the potential of women's cooperatives to address gendered barriers to the labour market in Turkey. Finally, authors focus on the urgent need to boost engagement with donors at all levels, be it local, national, or international. And UNHCR shares lessons from collaborations with other humanitarian and development actors. Last but absolutely not least, measuring and facilitating self-reliance is highlighted as an increasingly important topic in rethinking socioeconomic integration. So now that your interest, I hope, is piqued, if you haven't read the issue already, how can you access FMR? So we share FMR in two formats. The first is the full magazine, as Alice is now bringing up on the screen now. The full magazine, which includes a short piece from us, the editors, and all full article texts, as you can see there on the contents page. And the second format is a 6-page digest. So a shorter product which lists all articles and their web pages and QR codes, as you can see there. You can also download individual PDFs of each article from our website. And the main web page for FMR 71 has just been shared in the chat. So we very much enjoyed working on this issue, and we really hope that you enjoy reading it as well.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for taking us through. We hope that you'll be able to share the issue with as many people as possible. And yeah, so I'm sure the part that many of you have been waiting for is the panel of our wonderful authors who have agreed to be part of the discussion. We have Professor Alexander Betts, who is the director of the Refugee Studies Centre, where FMR is based, who will be moderating the session for us today. He is also the author of the highly relevant book, The Wealth of Refugees, How Displaced People Can Build Economies, which I thoroughly recommend. And he is also one of the authors of one of the articles in this issue, a really helpful overview article, which is a really good entry point to the issue. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alex to introduce the wonderful panel to us and to get the discussion going. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Alice. And let me begin by saying congratulations to Alice, Olivia, the entire FMR team, and all our contributing authors for putting together such an exciting special issue on socioeconomic integration. FMR really is one of the things that we're most proud of that we do at the Refugee Studies Centre. And I think this issue encapsulates what we're trying to achieve with FMR, to have focused issues that cover a range of themes from around the world, that include a diverse spectrum of voices and cut across research, policy, and practice. And to give you a flavour, a sense of some of the highlights of this great special issue, we've been able to pull together a panel of 4 of the contributing authors, so you can hear from them about their work and their contributions to the special issue. So I'm delighted to welcome all of our panelists and to briefly introduce them. I think what's really exciting is that all of them are working at the intersection of research, policy, and practice. The range of issues they cover in the special issue cover a variety of regions around the world and reflect on a series of different actors and themes related to socioeconomic integration, cutting across the digital economy, the role of affected populations, the role of the private sector, and the role of donors, for instance. So I'm joined by Lorraine Charles, who's co-founder and executive director of NAAMAL, and also a research associate of the Centre for Business Research at the University of Cambridge. Bisimwa Mulemangabo, who is the lead researcher of the Refugee-Led Research Hub based in Nairobi. Nassim Majidi, who's co-founder and executive director of Samuel Hall, and Samuel Davidoff-Gore, who's associate policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. The way I want to begin this conversation, if I may, is to suggest that each of the authors, or indeed in some cases co-authors, gives us some brief highlights of what their article is about, and then we can proceed from there to a brief panel conversation about the relevance for policy and practice, and then we'll turn to you, the audience, to offer your questions. So feel free, if you're listening to this, if something piques your curiosity and you want to put a question to one of the panelists or more than one of the panelists, feel free to enter your question in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. But perhaps first we could turn to you, Lorraine, to tell us a little bit about your piece that you co-authored with Lana Cook on the theme of opening the global digital economy to refugees.
Thanks, Alex. It's great to be here. So the digital economy is something that we hear about all the time, but it's something that is kind of ubiquitous, but still people are confused about it. The digital economy has transformed the way our society functions. COVID has made remote work more commonplace. Digital labor platforms have transformed the way we work. ChatGTP, the AI revolution, is transforming the work that we do. Now we can theoretically work anywhere. Work can be performed by anyone, regardless of nationality, race, geography, immigration status, and political label. The potential for the digital economy is huge, but we know the reality is different. There are challenges linked to access to education, nationality, geography, immigration status, and political label and race. Lana and I wrote this article to show that despite these challenges, there's a pathway for inclusion of refugees and other underrepresented communities in the digital economy. We wanted to show that the programs we run at NAAMAL and MIT React have joined forces to provide access despite these challenges. So in our article, which I hope you'll all read, we try to define the digital economy, for which there is no agreed upon definition. So we try to define the digital economy as incorporating all economic activity reliant on digital technology that can include jobs within and outside the traditional tech sector. So jobs which we don't perhaps consider as part of the digital economy, we define them as part. So digital labor or jobs ranging from logistics services like Uber and Deliveroo, micro work tasks such as data annotation, income generating activities on social media, online retail portals devoted to one-click consumption, and also high-skilled knowledge workers, the ones we're more familiar with, researchers, web developers, virtual assistants, lawyers, and accountants. So we explain how remote work is becoming normalized. The digital economy has the potential for lots for refugees to access, but yet there are challenges. These specific challenges that relate to refugees include the right to work. We know that most refugees live in places which limit their access to legal employment. Financial exclusion. 1 billion people worldwide are financially excluded, and this disproportionately affects refugees. Access to infrastructure. only 63% of the world's population is online. This means 2.9 billion are without internet connectivity. Skills, or a lot of the jobs which are being created are in the higher skills: AI learning, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, information technologists. According to Upward, the 5 top skills are full stack web development, front and back end web development, mobile app development, and web design. So we see the jobs which are emerging. Skills are required for individuals to access these jobs. Informality and precarity. Whilst the digital economy provides access, these jobs are still informal, leaving refugees without the protections. Most importantly, in our article, we share 2 success stories of alumni who have overcome these challenges and found meaningful and sustainable work in the digital economy. I'll leave it there.
Lorraine, that was as brilliantly clear and succinct as the piece itself. Thank you so much. Next, we'll turn to Bisimwa to talk about your piece. We are well able to stand on our own if we are given the opportunities, perspectives from affected populations in Uganda. Over to you, Bisimwa.
Thank you very much, Alex, and it's a pleasure being here. Yeah, so we know that affected populations, including refugees, know best what is good for them. And so it is precisely against this notion that humanitarian agencies are committed to the grand bargain participation revolution. So in my article, I use Uganda as a case study to show how socio-economic integration has tended to be based on short-term livelihoods interventions and not really including or integrating affected populations' voices and suggestions. And this has often led to kind of unsustainable socio-economic outcomes. So in my paper, I collected information from the conversations I had across the different settlements with the refugee community leaders on the solutions that could enhance their socio-economic integration, but also on what could be done to empower the community leadership structures to meaningfully participate in policy and program discussions so as to enhance their socio-economic integration. So I then summarize those views and give some key policy recommendations. So from the paper, 2 key policy recommendations emerge. One is to kind of adopt an approach-based response to refugee crisis. And this approach would take 3 main phases. The first one is the emergency phase, which would focus on providing life-saving emergency services like food distribution, housing, and health services to refugees who have just arrived from conflict-affected zones. The second would be the recovery phase, where focus would shift to more sustainable livelihoods interventions like skills training, supporting access to market opportunities, and providing more opportunities for refugees to start businesses and enterprises. And then finally, the self-sufficiency phase. The self-sufficiency phase would then allow for refugees to access more rights, like accessing the labor markets, being able to access the local jobs, and also accessing mobility, like providing travel documents, and for those who would like to access citizenship, permanent residency, then that would lead to a more local integration. So, and then second is to kind of to include refugees and persons affected by forced displacement in development programs from the government side. So what we are seeing is refugees are often left to the humanitarian agencies to take care of them. So what's happening is that these agencies provide short-term development, I would say short-term programs that do not build their resilience. And therefore, we are seeing that refugee communities are not resilient to shocks such as pandemics and local economic shocks. So these are the two key recommendations. And this is very important because refugees are not inherently a burden to the host governments, but they can be turned into an opportunity. They have the potential, they can contribute to the local economies, they can also contribute to the development of the host states. So basically, this is what my piece is all about. Thank you so much, and over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Bisimwa. Such a striking highlighting of how important it is to take into account the perspective of displaced populations in the design of programs of socioeconomic integration. Thank you very much for those perspectives. Next, we'll move to Nassim, and your piece co-authored with Camilla Fogley on public-private initiatives for local integration, evidence from Afghanistan and Kenya.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks, Olivia and Alice and everyone here for joining today. It's a real pleasure to connect from sunny Nairobi. For those of you who know us and who know my organization, Samuel Hall, we like to challenge narratives. We also like to connect the dots, which is what this logo represents, the different actors who all need to be involved on the discussion on solutions. So what we wanted to do with Camilla for this piece, and there were really three reasons why we wrote this piece on public-private partnerships for local integration. First, because we wanted to expand the conversation beyond the usual suspects. In many of the contexts that I work in, Afghanistan and Kenya, very often the conversation on solutions to forced displacement is led traditionally by humanitarian and development actors. So we wanted to first expand that conversation and also help make it more concrete. We often hear about studies recommending partnerships with private sector, but we rarely find guidance on how to do that, how to bring the two sides of the spectrum together. There are rarely concrete examples on how to do it, how it works, what can work. So that's what we offer in this piece. Second, we wanted to show how this can be done ethically and responsibly. So having meaningful partnerships. You heard about in the introduction from Mrs. Okay, you heard about the economic opportunities we have to keep in mind, but we also need to do that responsibly. So the examples I'll get to in a minute do that, really puts ethical action at the center, local action, as Bisimwa said, with and for forcibly displaced people and their communities to enhance their nutrition, their income, their inclusion. And third, very importantly for us, we wanted to bring different regions of the world to the fore to represent different contexts. The Horn of Africa is getting a lot of donor attention at the moment, but we shouldn't forget about contexts like Afghanistan in this case. Even more so in contexts like Afghanistan, where there is no official government, where public authorities are falling short of certain responsibilities. Private sector actors have an even bigger role to play in the search for solutions. So what does the article say? So the article draws on data that we collected between 2020 and 2022 in Afghanistan and Kenya, actually drawing from European Union funded initiatives that target displacement settings. And so here the focus is specifically on initiatives that targeted the agricultural sector. So we zoom in on first Ziba Foods. Ziba means beautiful in Persian. It's a snack food brand that produces grown nuts, sustainably grown nuts and dried fruits from local Afghan farmers, most of whom are displaced themselves, either internally displaced or refugee returnees. And they also work with women in their factory in Kabul to basically have as much of the value chain as possible in Afghanistan and to sell then the products on a global market and to have that income go back to the communities and go back to the women. We then take you to Kenya in our article, where we discuss the potential of ground nuts as a crop that can sustain both income and nutrition security for host and refugee communities in Turkana County. Remember that Turkana is a semi-arid and arid land area affected by climate change, so having these sustainable solutions is incredibly important for food security. So for Kenya, we talk about the work and the plans designed by another private sector company, Insta Products. It's a local company specializing in manufacturing low-cost nutritional products for emergency feeding programs. So they partner with United Nations agencies, and they work across the value chain, again, very much like Ziba in Afghanistan. They want to source the products locally, produce them locally, market, and then sell them locally and beyond. So the article really shows how these partnerships, because in both cases, they partner with UN agencies. So in Afghanistan with the International Trade Center, in Kenya with the Food and Agriculture Organization, it shows how their initiatives, bringing the UN and the private sector together, actually give us proof of concept of some initiatives that can be scaled and sustained, laying the foundations for commercial and ethical value chains approaches in displacement affected communities, providing opportunities for scaling up initiatives, and then just providing opportunities for including local marginalized groups, as I mentioned, for example, displaced women in the entire value chain. So hopefully, if you read the article, you will see that there really is potential from these two examples to do more. And to do that in difficult settings, whether it's semi-arid and arid lands, or whether it's in a context like Afghanistan undergoing profound political changes, this is when more than ever we need the private sector to provide us that local access and the sustainable solution.
Thanks, Nassim. It's so exciting to hear about this comparative perspective you take, looking at different regions of the world to more systematically learn about best practice in different regions. So really exciting, both the overview and the piece itself. Last but not least, let's move to Samuel and your co-authored piece with your colleague Camille Lecoz on the topic of boosting donor engagement to achieve refugees' socio-economic inclusion. Over to you, Samuel.
Great, thank you so much for having me in this conversation. So the article really came out of two streams of work that Camille and I have been doing. One on socioeconomic inclusion, specifically at the local level, and then one more on donor strategies and development approaches to refugee responses. And what we've seen is really the strategic and programming choices that donors and development actors make have a direct impact on socioeconomic inclusion outcomes. And as we are seeing a number of development agencies, especially in Europe, rethinking their strategies, as we have the Global Refugee Forum coming up in December, where there'll be lots of pledges. You know, we wanted to take a step back and think about what are some of the adjustments that donors, development actors can make to help improve the actual outcomes on the ground. And so in our article, we start by outlining 4 of the key limitations that we're seeing with the current donor strategies, which we should acknowledge at the start has been a vast improvement from 2015, 2016, when these when development approaches to refugee responses was really kind of in its a nascent field. But the first limitation is that the programs are often disconnected from the actual needs on the ground. I think Bisimwa highlights that very concretely in his piece. And the fact that these programs really don't take advantage of local knowledge and expertise, but rather, very much, come from a top-down approach. The second is that donors and development actors aren't really investing and prioritizing the sustained advocacy and policy dialogue that could help overcome some of these policy limitations that we see. For example, the right to work that hinder socioeconomic inclusion. Third is that programs are often short-term. Where donors aren't investing long-term, and the programs that they do have are really focused on getting short-term outputs rather than long-term outcomes. And then finally, there's an overall lack of sufficient coordination that inhibits knowledge sharing among donors, as well as with donors and governments. And this can really lead to duplicative programming. How many livelihoods programs, for example, are focusing on the same population in the same location, because the donors aren't talking with each other and all want to fund the same type of thing. So if donors engage at the national, subnational / local and regional levels, we think that they can start to overcome some of these limitations. So at the national level, by really embedding themselves in the policy environment and the policy dialogue at the national level, donors and development actors can have a much better understanding of what is feasible given the policy environment, where their leverage can best be used in terms of advocating for different solutions. And they can also see, where certain types of programming might just not be feasible and therefore not worth the investment, because they're not going to be able to get those long-term outcomes. At the local and subnational levels, I think it's very clear that learning from the folks who are living on the whose experiences these are is really critical. I think Luba Shara's piece in this article does a really great job of outlining what that local engagement should look like, and how doing really thorough needs assessments can be really helpful for donors and development actors or private sector actors in that piece's case. And then finally, at the regional level, there's really the opportunity for learning across different contexts, connecting different actors working at different levels of governance, and maintaining momentum for political reforms across countries. It also allows for donors to interact with each other across countries and share lessons learned that they may not otherwise be able to do so. Now, of course, these do have constraints, and I can get into those a bit more later. But just to conclude by saying that there's been a lot of progress already, but clearly there's a long way to go. And since we're at this decision point where there are so many pledges being made, or that will hopefully be made at the GRF, because there's so many conversations happening about what happens with EU funding, for example, in the areas where there used to be the trust funds that have now expired. What comes next there? This is really an opportunity for donors to take some risks and to shift their thinking in ways that could actually have concrete impacts on people's lives on the ground.
Thank you so much. I love this idea of multi-level donor engagement. It's not just global, it's regional, it's national, and particularly also local. And this appeal to donors to take some risks, to try things differently, to innovate, and in some cases learn by failing. Thank you all so much for such clear, succinct summaries of your pieces. You've already touched in some ways upon the policy recommendations that come from your pieces. But given that we have an audience that includes representatives of international organizations, NGOs, governments, I really want to take the opportunity for us to sort of double down on identifying what the key takeaways are for policy and practice from not just your pieces, but also the issue as a whole. And so I want to invite each of you to say briefly what's the one big message on socioeconomic integration in general that you'd like to land for policy and practice. What's the one big takeaway you want practitioners and policymakers to take from this conversation? What do we need to do to move the needle on socioeconomic integration? And just to get things underway, one big takeaway I take from all of you is the need for a culture of systematic learning, for policies to be evidence-based and evidence-generating, and for that idea of learning to particularly include local knowledge and knowledge from displaced and affected populations. But I'd love to hear from each of you what your one big policy message is. So perhaps Lorraine, we can come back to you.
Thanks. A really interesting question to think about what I would say to a policymaker. The world has changed. Refugees and people from the global south have been systematically excluded from opportunities that had only been possible for people in the global north, unless they migrate. The future of work is a digital economy. We believe that we need to provide the refugees and others in the global south the skills, the opportunities, so they can navigate this, navigate the new world. And look, holding down refugees, as Alex, you said in your article, refugees' psychosocial and well-being and a range of life quality indicators are improved by access to meaningful work. This is key, meaningful work. So many of the livelihood programs don't provide meaningful work. It's just, pennies being thrown, literally pennies being thrown at these populations in the global south. Technology is rapidly transforming the way we work and the way we perform work. We have to ensure that refugees have the skills to access the digital economy. By providing jobs to anyone, we can allow refugees and people in the global south to migrate by choice, not by necessity. And I think that's important. I want to say to everyone, give people the opportunity to migrate by choice, not by necessity. When refugees choose to resettle, they come with skills, with relevant experience, and with money in their pockets. So I think I would say to policymakers, we have to stop these pennies being thrown at projects. As you said, Samuel, all these projects are very short term. Donors think very short term. How many pilots can we do? We have to stop with this pilot mentality. Sustained and sustainable investment in education. This is the only way that we can really change a narrative. Investment in education. And I always challenge policymakers when I get confronted by, oh, your programs are too expensive. How much do you pay for your children's education? Why are we providing people who look like me but sound differently to me, different opportunities because they come from the global south? We have to think, how can we provide the best education for those who didn't have this access previously?
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Very clear message. We need skills for people to do meaningful work in the digital economy. Bisimwa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. The key message from my piece is really that we will not achieve sustainable socio-economic integration if we do not consider channeling the voices and perspectives of refugees and other affected populations in the policy discussions and program interventions. And I think we really need strong partnerships that place refugees and persons of concern, as they are called by UNHCR, at the center of everything that we do. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant, Bisimwa. That's crystal clear. Nassim.
Thank you, and I think it'll link up well with what Lorraine and Bisimwa have been saying, but also what, for example, Luba Shara wrote in her article, where she talks about why the private sector needs to be involved in the search for solutions. So I encourage you to read her article. But basically, my key message for policymakers would be to invest in and include the private sector in all migration partnerships. So when donors invest in traditional development or humanitarian partners, they need to pair them up to a private sector actor who is rooted in and aware of the context they engage with. Oftentimes, and I think this will respond to one of the questions in the chat, private sector actors can better maneuver also the legal and regulatory frameworks more easily than NGOs or United Nations agencies. So they can also be part of the solution, working with governments to create more open engagement with displaced and affected communities. So this is all part of the recommendation we put in the article around building an ecosystem that localizes the action through private sector actors who can source their products locally, add value to local communities, but also do so, as I said, ethically and responsibly. So really that's the key message. Include the private sector in everything that you do, and you will see the return on investments, not just in financial terms, but also in food security and nutrition for people, inclusion of women, but also in shaping more open legal and regulatory frameworks, which is what Luba says in her article.
So include the private sector, but do so by building ecosystems that allow that to happen, and do so ethically and responsibly. Samuel.
Yeah, I'd say my main message would be I mean, beyond just engaging more, being, acknowledging the potential for failure and being willing to embrace that. I actually, would push back slightly on the point about pilots. I do think that, pilots definitely have their place if they're conceived of smartly, if they're done based on local needs or national needs, and if they're monitored, if the lessons are shared. But I think, being willing to experiment and to innovate and to, spend some money on areas that, might be new types of partnerships are really crucial to identifying new types of programming that could have better impacts and identifying new partners that are much more, might be more relevant, especially in terms of refugee-led and community-based organizations, women-led organizations that are on the ground that might not have the ear or the eye of the donors. So I think that's all kind of encompassed in being willing to fail and taking that a bit of risk, because the payoff, I think, can be really really transformative.
Experiment and be prepared to take risks as donors, because the payoff can be enormous if we're prepared to fail and learn from it. Brilliant. Some very clear recommendations. We've got some great questions coming in from the audience. Please type your questions in the Q&A box. I think scanning through the questions, I can see at least one question for each of you. So I'm going to try and target my questions based on the question themes and the topics in your articles. I'm going to begin with a question that I think is directed towards Lorraine, and it's from Tenor, and it really speaks to the idea of digital inequality in the world. And it's given the huge digital divide between developed and underdeveloped countries, how realistic is the idea of opening up the digital economy for refugees? And in the context of digital inequality, what are some of the barriers to that?
Very good question. One thing that I have to say is, in lots of places, digitalization and access is increasing significantly. In Africa, in the last 10 years, there's been tremendous strides on digital inclusion. We're not there yet. As I said earlier, 2.9 billion people still don't have access to the internet, but the numbers are decreasing. There are organizations that are promoting internet as as a human right. Connectivity is a human right. So it's changing. But what we need to do is we have to ensure that when the connectivity catches up, we have individuals with the skills who can take advantage of this. So we're not there yet, but we have to be prepared. And we can't sit back and wait until the connectivity comes. The connectivity is coming. I'm doing some research on digital platforms in Africa, and just as a preliminary view, we've identified 100 digital work platforms in Africa, just in Africa, on the continent. And whilst it's concentrated in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, the numbers are increasing. So it is coming. So whilst access is still problematic, lack of connectivity is the biggest issue, but lack of meaningful connectivity. So whilst there's some 4G connectivity in some places, it's expensive and connectivity is not good, but it's changing. So we have to be prepared for when that happens. And Starling and other organizations are taking huge strides for greater global connectivity.
Terrific. Thanks, Lorraine. Question for Bisimwa that comes from David's question, who says that while the strategies you mentioned are hopefully feasible, what do you see as the challenges that might hamper your recommendations being implemented? So in terms of being able to take seriously the voices and perspectives of affected populations, displaced people, in terms of taking on board the kinds of recommendations that emerge from your Uganda research, like increasing opportunities for mobility as a pathway to livelihoods. What are some of the challenges around trying to persuade governments and donors to come on board with that agenda?
Yeah, thank you so much, David, for the question. Yeah, I think one of the main challenges first is going to be, I would say, funding. Because as for this year, Uganda is host to about 1.5 million refugees. And about 10 years ago, there were about 250,000 refugees. So you can see how the numbers have actually been increasing over the years. And what this means is that there's need for more resources. In terms of channeling refugee voices, we've seen the government and humanitarian agencies really kind of struggling to get it right, because in their budgets, they don't have specific lines dedicated to consult, like I would say, accountability to affected populations, like consulting communities. And so this has been a very big challenge, especially on the part of the humanitarian agencies, but also on the part of the government. So I think this is going to be a challenge, but this is a challenge that can be solved if agencies work closely with the donors, because I know donors, most of the donors have committed to, you know, a kind of accountability. And it would be, I think, an opportunity for organizations to start factoring in their program design aspects of accountability to affected populations. Then from the government side, mostly like including refugees and other affected populations in government programs, there has been an issue of funding as well. And the government has been really kind of trying to mobilize funds, but hasn't been enough. We've seen funds being mobilized for, I would say, education programs, but still access to education is really very limited for refugees, especially access to tertiary education. And so the other challenge is that I think it's a challenge of perception on the part of, I would say, specific government officials that say refugees are catered for by humanitarian agencies, UNHCR and others. Yet the available resources are not enough. And also we've seen that even the programs that come through these agencies, host communities are included. So I think it's also upon the government to also include refugees in some of their programs and development interventions, like tertiary education, access to government scholarships, access to jobs, some kind of jobs, because refugees apparently cannot, as much as there's that kind of policy that allows refugees to work, there are jobs that a refugee cannot be given. So I think these are some of the issues or challenges that I anticipate, but these challenges can be overcome if stakeholders work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bisimwa. And in some ways, it links to some of what Samuel was also saying about donors needing to take risks. But in the chat, Tammy Sharp also highlights the challenge for host governments that you allude to, Bisimwa, saying there's often a commonly held view by host governments who have their own development challenges that refugees are a humanitarian issue. And there's often a deep trust deficit in being able to recognize that development funding should go to and support refugee populations. So some of those structural challenges apply very much to what you were saying. Samuel, there's a question that you're perhaps best placed to think about, which is about donor coordination that comes from Maximilian. He says it's true that donor coordination is typically lacking almost everywhere, and unless incentives change, it's difficult to make it more natural to donors to work together. I wondered if you have any reflections on how we can improve donor coordination along the lines of the type of donor engagement that you referred to.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I think part of it is just facilitating the conversations between donors, so creating spaces for them to start to break down some of those perhaps barriers that that tend towards either secrecy or strategic, wanting to hold their cards close to their chest. which I think can sometimes happen, or thinking that, oh, our data is really proprietary and we can't share these lessons necessarily. I think having coordination at lots of different levels can help break some of this down. And so there's whether it's coordinating in the field and making sure that at the local level your project officers are in constant communication, making sure that there are structures at the national level for constant dialogue, and then also having those more global or capital city level opportunities. So I think having it at multiple levels can be really critical, but I think having that institutional culture starting at the ground level and sharing that information and demonstrating how important it is to share that information could be one way of starting that. But I think it's an area where there needs to be experimentation as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And Nassim, a final question for you about public-private partnerships and the need to look at them in context. So in the context of Afghanistan, there's an anonymous question about the challenges of working in a context where the Taliban is in government. What does it mean for public-private partnership to unfold where there are such stringent processes and systems in place and lack of trust for the West? And more generally, what does this tell us about the need to look at public-private partnerships within different national contexts?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. It's specifically in a context like this with so many constraints, restrictions put on women, put on the NGO sector, that the private sector actually has more space to act. So access is easier today for private sector actors than, let's say, other type of actors. So it's even more relevant now than before. And I think it really puts to a test the way the last 20 years went in Afghanistan, where there was an over-reliance on external, as you say, Western aid actors. This is really an opportunity to, we said localize, but to really just embed in the local and invest in the local economies. Now, when we talk about investing in the local economies, another thing I wanted to highlight in our recommendations is that we say it's not just about the money, it's about investing in the capacities for small, medium, large enterprises to be able to engage in these questions. There needs to be a lot more training programs. I mean, global graduate business schools could get involved in really helping private sector organizations all across displacement affected communities to build capacity, to know how to work, to know how to standardize operations, how to become more sustainable, how to market products. There's a lot more we can do in supporting the private sector, but in terms of access, they have it in many contexts more than other actors.
Thank you so much, all four of you, for a really rich, fascinating, and inspiring set of presentations relating to your pieces. We've got some really clear policy recommendations, building skills for the digital economy, including the voices of displaced people, working better with the private sector and more systematically, and experimenting and taking risks as a donor community. Let me just thank you for your contributions and hand over to Alice to pick up the wrap up.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Just see what a rich discussion from just 4 of our authors. So I'd encourage you all to read more widely in the issue if you haven't already, and see this is just a representation of the amazing content in the piece. So I'd like to introduce Davidoff-Gore, Global Human Mobility Advisor at UNDP. He's been a great support to us over the last year, and he's going to give some very brief closing comments from UNDP. And then we'll have an opportunity to thank all the different people that have been involved. So over to you, David.
Thanks, Alice. It was great to have this event and all this collaboration with you guys and prepare this special issue. So for UNDP, it was really a great experience, and also listening today and lots of food for thought. I've just come back from Chad. I was there for about 10 days and still jet lagged. But you know, it's quite impressive because you go there and people have been displaced for a decade or so and still receiving humanitarian assistance. And when you talk with displaced people, being refugees or IDPs, most of them say, we don't want this kind of life. We don't want to receive food and receive cash every day until we don't know when. What we want is to have a job, being able to contribute, and this is what socio-economic integration is about having people having their own sources of income. And I always say that the best humanitarian aid you can provide to someone is to give a job. Or to help them find a job. So that's really what it is about. And sometimes there is a confusion, and in particular among the UN actors, about what it means, socioeconomic integration in practice. And we tend to confuse that with livelihoods activities. And I would say livelihoods are necessary, but they are not sufficient. When we talk about socioeconomic integration, we need to work closely with the governments because it depends on them. They are the ones that are going to allow refugees or even IDPs in some cases to work. They are going to regularize those who are in an irregular situation. They are going to help refugees have access to labor markets, to financial inclusion, opening a bank account, create a business. Sometimes they are not allowed to do that. So we have lots of ambitions about what it means and how we can support refugees and IDPs, but in most cases, it's in the hands of the government. So this is why UNDP works closely with the governments to help them have their own policy, their own strategies to integrate forcibly displaced people. We have been working with the Colombian government on integrating Venezuelan displaced people into the economy and the society. We are working with the Moldovan country government to help with the integration of Ukrainian refugees. As I mentioned, we are supporting the Chadian government to integrate IDP. So that's very important to help the governments in countries affected by forced displacement to have their own strategies and to develop their own policies. And I think I don't want to take too much time, but at the end, the UN, the governments, they don't create the jobs. So this is why it's so important to work with the private sector, because they are the one creating most of the jobs. So we have to work with them, to incorporate them into the responses, to make them aware of the importance of working on socioeconomic integration. And last but not least, and that has been mentioned and also in the chat, we need to integrate the host communities. We cannot just support forcibly displaced people, again, being refugees or IDPs. Host communities have to be part of the response. We have to work on reducing tensions between communities, on fighting against discrimination, on fighting against racism, because that happens too. And this is why the work on social cohesion is so important and so complementary of the work on socioeconomic integration. Over to you, Alice. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, David. A few things from the FMR team. We want you to know that our next issue is about Ukraine, very pertinent this week, particularly as we remember the anniversary of the invasion. It's about insights and implications that will be coming out in September. We've got a mini feature coming out about mobilizing for rights in the MENA region. That will be coming out in May. And then later in the year, relevant to a lot of the topics today, we've got an issue coming out about digital disruption and displacement that we're really excited about. And the call for articles for that should open in March. So please do keep a lookout. In order to keep up to date with all of FMR's news, you can follow us on social media and you can sign up for our email list, and the links will be appearing in the chat now so that you can do that. Please do keep in touch if you've got ideas, if you would like to partner with us in different ways, then please get in touch. I think now we're going to share some of the thank yous that we need to do for today. We had an amazing set of reviewers, an amazing set of authors, and so we'll be sharing on the screen now alongside our financial donor and partner UNDP. So thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate you taking the time to think about this important topic, and we look forward to seeing you again at a future FMR event. So thank you, everyone. I think we're just getting the slides up. Yes, there we go.